Jesus claiming to be God, greater than the temple. Imagine a courtroom that is empty, nothing but chairs and tables. By itself, it's just chairs and tables. It's just an empty room. It is only the presence of the judge which brings the true authority. The judge who presides in the chamber is greater than the chairs and greater than the tables. Jesus' disciples were hungry one day, and they began to pick some heads of grain to eat them as they were going through the fields. Now, this happened on the Sabbath day. The religious leaders saw this as an opportunity to harass Jesus, and so they accused his disciples of doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Jesus, in response, makes two statements about his own divinity by identifying himself with God. Jesus reminds the religious leaders of a time in Israel's history, in the book of Samuel, when King David and his men ate bread that was consecrated and only for the priests who would normally be allowed to eat it. But God's love for his people and his mercy for the hungry is greater than tradition. And so David and his men ate because God allowed them to eat. Jesus then reminds the religious leaders that even in the law of Moses, the priests performed duties of a priest on the Sabbath. And yet, though they are performing work on the Sabbath, they're not guilty of anything wrong. And so Jesus is showing that the heart of God is greater than a mere list of rules. Then Jesus gives this powerful statement. He says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Jesus is claiming that he outranks in greatness the most sacred place in all of Israel. Jesus is claiming to outrank the place where God would meet his people in Jerusalem. Only God could say that he was more important than the temple. And Jesus said it because Jesus was claiming to be God. Again, to call himself greater than the temple. Again, to call himself greater than the temple was either blasphemy or it was truth. If the temple was God's dwelling place on earth, then only greater things. If the temple was God's dwelling place on earth, then the only greater thing would be God himself dwelling with people in a more full way. And that's exactly what Jesus stated and the Bible teaches. You see, in John's gospel, we see the image clearly when John says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The word for dwelling in this verse means to tabernacle. It means the place of God's presence in the Old Testament. God became flesh to be present with us in an incredible way. And this is what we see Jesus saying about himself in Matthew chapter 12. The Word of God shares the story of the dedication of that temple almost 1,000 years before Jesus spoke those words. King Solomon prayed and, quote, When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of God filled the temple. The priest could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. Now, look at that powerful language. The temple is a place where God's glory is seen and shines so powerfully that even the priests could not enter into it when the glory of God filled it. It would indeed be blasphemy for anyone except God to say something greater than the temple is here. But the temple's greatness comes entirely from God's presence. Without the presence of God, the temple is just stone. And Jesus states that his body is the true temple, the place where God dwells bodily. For the audience witnessing Jesus' words, they, of course, being a people centered on worship and centering their worship and identity on the temple, to claim to be greater than the temple meant that you were claiming to be the ultimate meeting place between God and humanity. As with other statements of Jesus, some people are worried about the conclusion that Jesus is God and claim to be so. And so they suggest that Jesus was only saying, well, my teaching is more important than your traditions. But that cannot be what Jesus is talking about, because Jesus does not compare himself to the priests. Jesus does not compare himself to the teachings of even Moses. Jesus does not compare himself to the sacrifices. Instead, Jesus compares himself to the temple itself. The temple was not a teacher. The temple was God's earthly dwelling. Outranking the temple means outranking the old system. Only God can make that claim. Now, what does this mean for you? Well, if Jesus is greater than the temple, then that means he is the ultimate meeting place between God and humanity. This means that access to God is no longer tied to a special location, but to a person, and that person is Jesus Christ. It also means that worship and forgiveness come through Jesus, not through a building. The temple was the center of God's presence for Israel, but now the one who is greater stands before you. He does not invite you to a place. Jesus invites you to himself. Will you come to the true dwelling place of God? Will you come to the one who is greater than the temple?